Okay, and we're live. Hey everybody, I'm Wes. Welcome to the Web Server Frameworks team meeting for July 9th. We've only got a few folks on the call and we have a huge agenda that is awesome. So we're probably going to talk first about the organization plan for the new HTTP org. Oh, sorry, I've got feedback because it opened. There we go. And then we have the technical plan for the new HTTP core, but I think we'll probably put that off. And then we've got a couple other things that I think are probably going to get the agenda item removed. So it might be a short meeting, but go ahead and add yourselves to the minutes. Do you have the minutes there? I can post it in the chat here.
Sounds good.
Okay, so so I'll get started just talking about this is issue number 54. This is the Future of HTTP Organization Plan is the title of the issue. So just to recap what we had from the session 2 weeks ago now for the Collaborators Summit. We were discussing something that has been an ongoing topic. What does this look like for the frameworks when HTTP 2 is getting very low adoption? What happens when HTTP 3 gets introduced? There's a bunch of API differences that are basically irreconcilable there's a few options laid out, but the one that has the most promise is to go ahead and write for now, user-land implementation of a high-level HTTP API with the intent that in the future it gets pulled into core, either replacing or somehow becoming the main HTTP interface over what we currently have. And then what will actually live in core will be just the low-level protocol layer implementations. So there's another issue here that we probably won't talk too much about that James did update with the start of a plan. But what we want to talk about is this group and how we fit in with that future if we want to look at chartering, if we want to start a separate org where we will do these, and I don't know if we have, is there an official name for the modules? I guess the vendored in packages, whatever we want to call them, where we'll work on the implementations for this, which will be owned by the Nodeorg, but intended to be vendored in at some point in the future. So sort of how we want to structure that work and the team and the organization around that.
Right. So you're thinking of like an org, making an org that's not necessarily specific to the web server frameworks, but it would be like the first project to use it, or?
Well, so the reason why we talked about this was sort of similarly going off of what James had been doing with Quick, which is not implementing it in Node.js Node. There was a bunch of benefits for him to doing that. Also, this is a really big and really long-term change. So I think part of the idea there, and why James brought that up, was that it would be more easy to manage the people involved and everything if it was not quite as visible. And
right.
And if especially since this is so experimental in some ways, doing this big new API, lower the risk, as opposed to trying to do it in Node Core, or even mixing in the possible 5 or 6 different packages we'll be making into the Nodeorg, where they'll be lost among the hundreds.
Yeah, like in the past, things like an API Quick have been done on a fork, which was a repo in the organization.
Yeah.
This wouldn't be a fork, right? It would be an implementation.
Yeah, wholly separate.
Right. We also have Node add-on API, which is a module not shipped with Node, but in the Nodeorg. I think there's probably a couple others. Nan is probably another, and so just to date, you know, it would be pretty easy to just say, you know, get another repo. Now it sounds like you think there's going to be a bunch of them.
I mean, I don't know if we have enough to make that decision. The reason this came up on the call last time, we've got Ethan just joined. So the reason it came up on the call last time was that, yeah, it sounded like there might be a bunch, and I'm trying to remember. I should probably pull up the meeting notes from that call and see if there was a good synopsis of why we discussed that.
So that would have been another organization that has multiple smaller libraries in it.
Yeah, that was sort of the general idea. Let me see if I can find the notes from.
I mean, I'd be tempted to try and keep it as simple to start.
I mean, I'm tempted to just have a Node.js /HTTP repo where we,
Right.
gather all of these things.
Yeah, that sounds like a great simple start
to start with.
So
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot less, than creating an org, getting a charter, all that kind of stuff. And then if there is a bunch of them and, a new org makes sense, you say, okay, we've got these 5, let's do that, right? Or whatever.
Yeah, I remember us talking about exactly that. Like, let's start with just a repo in Node that we do this work in, and then when it's necessary to expand to something bigger, we go down that path. But let's actually do some of this work first to make sure that it needs its own org or charter or whatever.
Yeah, I think that seems like a good plan. Presumably it will be a mono repo of multiple packages though, because I don't think, right, we're starting off first thing with probably a bunch of, we're going to probably have the new headers implementation will probably be pulled into there, right? Like there's a bunch of lower level HTTP. Sorry, I'm not on video, but I did air quotes. I was saying HTTP related implementations, right? They won't be the main thing, but I think it makes sense to write them as separate packages. So as long as we're comfortable, like, we'll be building a mono repo implementation of multiple HTTP style packages, then I'm definitely good with making a single repo in Node.
At least to start with.
Yep. Yeah. Totally. Right. We can move them out at any point.
Another thing I wanted to discuss on this topic was as well, is this only server or is it client as well? Because as I understood from James, the difference between client and server in HTTP2 and HTTP3 is smaller and smaller. So it
which
might
it's already
make sense
which it's already not entirely separate now. So even in one, right? So if it's getting closer and closer, it seems to me that would be a reasonable thing, but it would, and I say expand, we haven't really set the scope yet, but it would be clearly expanding the scope beyond just the initial problem, which is server adoption of HTTP 2 and 3.
But you could say like the primary focus is the server, but keeping in mind that the client work might come in the future, to leave the stubs or whatever, make the API make sense in both ways might be a good thing.
And we also wanted to bring in some of those client library authors and get their opinion, because right now we have a lot of server-side frameworks being represented, but none of the client frameworks or whatever you call them being represented. So we want to see like, what do they want out of this? What do they expect? Considering, is anyone really building their clients from the ground up, or are they just relying on what's in Node core? So we have to cover those bases before we start changing things.
Yeah, there was also
Yeah,
some
it goes-
discussion of that Undici, or did I say that module right? Which is a userland full re-implementation. So, you know, it's possible that if that sort of gets legs, that we may, you know, this would be a good initiative to house the work of, you know, rewriting or pulling that into core as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does seem like there's some synergy between the two of them. So at least having the door open makes a lot of sense.
I'm mostly concerned about, you know, having lots of different APIs that could have been the same, but they didn't end up because we were working on them separately.
Yeah.
Like you pull in Undici now, which makes perfect sense. The API is in HTTP 1, but then, you know, it doesn't quite make sense in HTTP 2 and 3. And yeah. And then you end up with 6 different APIs doing the same thing. And then everybody's confused about what to use and what not to use.
Yeah, and especially since we're going to be making that worse already by saying we're fully re-implementing the HTTP API.
Exactly.
So, yeah, that's a good point. Great. So I think like I think what we'll post here as a follow-up is we do think one repo inside of the Nodeorg is the start for sure. We think that we need to holistically look at the HTTP space. That includes server and client. Whether that means we do an implementation for the client just yet, we can leave open-ended.
Yep.
So then the next question is, with those two things in mind, do we need a charter for this? Like, or is this just a team? Is this just we can be the team that, I mean, we're choosing the direction for HTTP for Node core here, which is not, you know, something typically you do with an unchartered
It
right?
like typically for the working groups, the you know, the working groups have been chartered after they've got the work kind of well underway. But other than that, you know, I don't think it's like, because there's lots of things that can be charted. So it could be, it's good to have it on the TSC radar visibility. Whether like a charter request is the best way to do that, or maybe a strategic initiative that's on the strategic initiative list with a TSC champion.
That would make sense to me.
I think either of those make sense, like, because, you know, it's until things are getting pulled into core, or like, it's not that like you need formal decision making chartered, right? Or passed on, or.
Well, I think that's sort of what's happening, isn't it? I mean, this is the decision for the whether or not to move forward with this technical plan that James laid out.
Yeah, I guess in my mind, like, the reality is that even if you got a charter, you need to make sure that like the collaborators are on board, the TSC is on board, right? Just because you get a charter and says, hey, you know, you're now in charge of this, I'm not sure it actually changes the need to keep everybody sort of in consensus with what's going forward.
I mean, until it actually affects Node core, is there, what's the purpose of a charter?
The charter, like for working, you know, there's teams that get together, just work on things, and then there's working groups. And the only difference is that the charter formally delegates responsibility for some area to the working group. But in my mind, it still comes back to, that doesn't mean you can go off and do whatever you want, right? Like, you still need to have the consensus. And when you come back and say, hey, here's something we want to be pulled into core, you know, you still have to have everybody lined up and saying, sure, that makes sense, right? And whether the charter, I don't know that the charter totally changes that.
But I mean, when we have something that we would like to propose pulling into core, then I think it makes sense to have a charter to, you know, okay, we're a serious group, we're gonna handle this, and we can put it into core. But before that, I don't really see, you know.
Right, and
right
then the
now
charter
we're just
can make
proof
sense.
of concept.
Right, at that point also, it can be like the charter can be responsibility for guiding the future direction of that module, or, it's the, what is it? What are the special privileges you want, or the special things you want to be able to do, out of that charter?
And we kind of have to prove ourselves a little bit before when we can start asking for those kind of things, at least in my opinion.
That's where, like, I'd get the repo, get some stuff going, make sure it's very visible, right? Like, I think a strategic initiative with, maybe James is the champion, so that he reports to the TSC every week, is important. Like, it's important to have that visibility regardless. So that's where I'd start anyway.
I mean, we want as much feedback as possible during the progress here.
Right.
Okay, sounds good to me. So that, I think, so the decision here for the organization plan will be what Ethan just posted. Wow, yeah, great. Okay.
Yeah, let me know if anything needs to change there. But that's what I basically got from listening to this.
And how do we go about making this happen?
So this is an admin. We need to open an issue in the admin repo to just get the repo. Before we do that, we should make sure we settle on a name. And are we sure? Do we think that just calling it HTTP is actually, or does that already exist as the HTTP? Let me just.
I think it's time for a code name.
Yeah. So there's an archived HTTP, which is the old working group.
Like HTTP next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's
almost a code word. So
yeah, let's just post an the name. Well, see, yeah, we can. Ethan, do you want to add it and just add at the end? Does anybody have any opposition to naming it HTTP next? And then
sure thing.
We can
let's start with one repo, Node.js.
Where are you typing that? Because I've been typing some notes in the issue as well too.
Oh, I'm in the organization plan issue.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I was taking notes in the minutes, but that's a better place for that.
Cool. Yeah, I didn't know if someone was already writing minutes or not, so I was just going to comment. Called HTTP next. Anyone oppose to this?
Great. Okay, so I think we've are pretty good on this one. Do we want to move on and just see what comes of? Obviously, we won't be making any big decisions, but chat on the issue number 55, the technical plan.
Sure.
So anybody, do you want me to lay out the landscape, or do we all have we all read this post from James?
I've read it once or twice, but I probably need it to be restated as well.
Okay. So, and I don't think he went over the problems. Did he really? Well, so he says, due to organic and incremental way HTTP1, HTTP West, wow, it's 6 a.m. Sorry. HTTPS support. I just saw my name above and I'm like, HTTPS support involved in core. The fundamental differences between HTTP2 and the desire for us to break any existing userland and not to break any existing userland code to support 1.2 in core has become less than ideal, right? So that's the problem statement. And I think that really leads to where we want to go, which is a new HTTP API that paves over some of the differences we see, where it would be a breaking change to 1 in the ecosystem, but we think we can do that breaking change outside of this and come up with a more concise, more maintainable HTTP API, which covers all 3 protocol formats. So the idea is that the working group, us here, and extended here, have a new high-level user-facing API that is built on top of the lower level protocol implementations in Node core. So instead of there being, to start, you know, there, or maybe the first version of this will be a userland module, so like publish to npm, that sits on top of just like the TCP and HTTP2 core stacks, and then Quick, obviously, for 3. And everything else will live in the userland implementation. So this will give us a chance to rethink a lot of the things where frameworks have had stumbling blocks, right? Where we've re-implemented the same thing across all the different frameworks. This will give us a chance to consolidate the core parts, which have been hard to change in the past, because, you know, if we change a bunch of them to be HTTP2 based, or one of the things that got brought up was like, what if we swapped HTTP1 to be on top of Quick? Like an HTTP1 API, the exact as on top of Quick. And it's like, well, the chance of, even though there's a huge performance benefit, the chance of that breaking somebody is like astronomically high. Like it's going to break people. It's very difficult to get right. So this gives us the opportunity to do a lot of this work outside of that structure, come up with something good, and then in the future, once it's stabilized, talk about what that looks like, replacing HTTP 1 and 2 as it is currently, and HTTPS in core. So is that a good high level synopsis?
Yeah, I think so.
I think so. A few things that came to mind is we should keep in mind what happens when there's an HTTP4. Like, can we make this somehow extensible, or like, I don't know, I think of, you know, at the OS level, you know, you have socket options you can enable and disable, and so maybe it's impossible, but like, is there a way that as we go through it, is there a way to make this like extensible, or, you know, so that you don't have to change it when you need the next one or something like that?
So I think there's a bunch of challenges to that, right? Seeing into the future is impossible. And one of the reasons why the HTTP 3 layer was going to be so difficult was because there are distinct differences, right? So like, is there a way that we think we can avoid that? Like, knowing that we can't predict the future here, like, is there something that we can do technically to
I think part of it is, yeah, I mean, I think I don't have like a specific, but it's like, as we design it, let's not design it so that it exactly fits 1, 2, and 3. Right? Like, and I assume that's already the intention. Is like, it's, if you can make it so it's abstract enough. But
so
then
in some regard, I see just calling this like one HTTP API that covers HTTP, HTTPS, HTTP2, and HTTP3 already sort of is setting that groundwork, right?
Right. Yeah. No. I think it's on the. Anyway, I don't think we should go into it too much, because you're right, we can't predict the future. But that should be like one of the aspirations should be that it's very much something that we hope will be able to inherit future things as well.
There is a thought experiment we can do here. Like, we have these 3 different versions. What is the least common denominator? Sorry, denominator.
Right.
Can we implement that? And the things that are outside of that, could we implement that as plugins or, you know, extensions or etc.?
Right. Yeah. Something like that.
So, for example, what is the fundamental? I mean, pushing is quite fundamentally different in HTTP2. And would that be possible to implement as an extension on top of a different API? I mean, it's difficult to answer now, but I guess that's the things we should consider there.
Well, so I kind of thought about that a little bit, because when we were talking about this in Express, I was, you know, thinking hard on what does that look like to an app developer, and really what I think it looks like is you have a view layer that is totally separate from the framework or from the HTTP implementation that needs to like parse some HTML, find that there's a JavaScript file in that HTML, and then call a method which serves that file over push, right? So like that's really where we're going to see push used in the mainstream, right? Like there's a lot of other crazy things, but like really the like bread and butter of push is that, right? It's like you're serving an HTML page, find some assets in it and push them, right? Which is really just one method. So in that regard, if that's what we're worried about, we just need to carve out space for like a dot push. I mean, and that can't work because of streams and blah, blah, blah. But like we come up with something, right? HTTP server push or one method that handles that. And I think that's like a pretty simple API to layer on top. I don't actually know that we need to design around volatility there even, because if a new protocol comes up and has the same feature, we will need to make, you know, changes to that existing API. I don't see that as like a fundamentally tough design problem. It's like, that's like one method. Like, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong and there's some, you know, reason why that won't work, but.
I think it also comes down to the API interface here that we're discussing, where right now we have like all of these different modules, like 4 different distinct server implementations and then 3 clients, where the idea is we rebuild this where we just have one thing and then we could to cover all of those. And then when HTTP 3 comes in, we're not adding a new server implementation or a new client implementation. We're just building on top of the already existing thing. So when HTTP 4 comes out, I think that idea is the same, where rather than rewriting a new HTTP 4 server and client as like a separate, we just build it on top of whatever we already have. And if there's changes that need to be made to some of the underlying pieces, I think it would be similar to how there would be a difference between the underlying pieces between 1, 2, and 3 of some kind. So I think maybe that's a little bit of the future path for this stuff.
Yeah, and I suppose maybe an API which allows you to expose all 3 of them is already, hopefully, you know, covering a lot of the ground that when 4 comes out, it'll have to have that flexibility.
Do we
I mean, I think
have?
back.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
I was going to say that the other, like the earlier question about it would be too big a risk to turn on quick underneath. I mean, we can think of, I'd also think like, how would we handle that in this new one through opt-in or something like that, right? Where you could say, I'm still using the same API, but I'd like to opt into quick as the transport, or, you know.
Yeah, I mean, in my world, you would just send in a net module, which is net TLS, net TCP, and net quick, and it would just work. And then it could be net whatever.
Right, that's a great example of,
yeah,
like an API that lets you select what I want my underlying thing to be. And even, you know, that's nice in some ways.
Could be SSH, you know.
Yeah, you can make up your own, right? It's got some nice benefits from
as
that.
long as it sends the bytes.
I'm not confident that works, does it? Like, okay, so for so there's some that are so quick. If you sent quick or made up your own, I'm trying to think like what. There's a lot of strong assumptions that need to be made, tightly bound between the HTTP layer and the user-facing HTTP layer and the protocol, right? Like you're not going to make up your own. What does the headers API look like across these, right? We know it's already different, you know, meaningfully in some ways different across some of these. And then you're going to make up your own, and what does that have different semantics? And now does that affect, like, you can't just swap, there are some things where you have to pass in.
But
there's upgrades too to consider, right? Like, what if you wanted to expose, you wanted to be able to handle 1, 2, and 3 from your application, right? So what you'd want to pass in is a net 1, net 2, net 3, right? I say, you know, one to back each, because you're never going to back HTTP 2 with quick. You're never going to back HTTP 3 with an HTTP 2 core. Right. So like if you were exposing a server that you wanted to be able to I guess you could say that then you'd have to open 3 servers, which is what you'd have to do now. Okay, maybe I'm making, you know, a problem where there isn't one. But
I think this is part of the fun, right? Like I think, you know, in my mind, the aspiration, I was just starting with let's not set ourselves up to have to repeat this again. But it's going to be aspirational, because I think you're right that there'll be some places like performance or whatever make it really hard. But if we don't at least start with that, like we shouldn't end up with something that has 3 specific, you know, an HTTP1, HTTP2, HTTP3 part of the API, right? It should be one API, hopefully, that you can opt in or, you know, extend or whatever the options from each of the different ones, because then that should give us better confidence that when you get to 4, you can just do the same.
And then, so this is the big question then, what happens if you're on a net implementation that doesn't support, you know, so if we are talking about HTTP to push, but you have that method on the API and you're in an HTTP1 server, does the method not exist? Does it throw? Is it a no-op? Like, what is the, you know, what does that look like when you don't have underlying, you know, network support?
I don't think it can be a no-op.
No, but I mean,
I don't know.
you pick the level, the version of the interface you want, and then that has a requirements on the transport layer, for example.
But this puts us back in the same spot. We've got Express middleware, and the middleware author now has to say, what type of server am I running in? Can I call that method? So say there's a view layer, you know, somebody's implementing a React server-side rendering view layer, and they want to pull out all of the JavaScript assets, minify them on the fly, and send them back to the client. And they're like, okay, cool, this is awesome. I'm going to use HTTP2 ServerPush when it's available. Well, when it's available. Now they were writing just a single method that got loaded into an Express app. Now we have to give them the server instance so that they can then infer whether it's HTTP 1, 2, or 3, so they know whether or not to be able to call those.
I wouldn't want to do that. I would want it more to be like a can push method or some way that they ask, do I have a capability, not am I 1, 2, or 3?
Good point. Even still, we are pushing a lot of complexity into the space of the module maintainer, you know, the middleware maintainer, the plugin implementer, which didn't exist before. If we're fine doing that, then that's that. But it's
I might be, I don't know that much about push, but I mean, as long as it behaves as if it did push. I mean, if it hasn't pushed, you call the method and it acts like it did push, but it didn't, then would the client notice? Because they would just request the resource.
Right.
So then it would behave as if it did push. The user would just notice that it's slower.
Right. This would be maybe considered some sort of like graceful degradation approach, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
The only challenge there is you may be burning cycles you didn't need to, like by going away and collecting everything you needed to do the push. So there's kind of that's sometimes it's nice to tell people so that they don't waste time for you just to silently ignore it. But then you're balancing
But then
off.
it's a choice.
Right.
The middleware author doesn't have to worry about it if he doesn't want to.
Yeah, you could have the call that says, you know, push supported, and if the answer is no, they could choose not to do it, but you could also allow them to just call the method and it do nothing. So
you still need to retain an instance of the server to do that, right? You got to have something that's going to carry this context around. I guess you could put it on all so we could have an API on all the request responses that say which features are supported. I guess could work.
Yeah, if you're going to call push, you have something you're going to call it on, right?
Yeah, you'd say like res.can server push, and then you know, if you know, then bail if it doesn't. Yeah. Yep, that's sounds pretty good.
Is there any other of these big differences with HTTP3, or is push the only thing that's
so I think the fact that it is not a transaction, it actually keeps state, right? or it's not a stateless transaction, right? Like it is in HTTP 1. So both HTTP 2 and 3 have some of this.
You kind
Right.
of have it in HTTP 1.1 as well, right? With pipelining.
Ah, yeah. Yep. That's true. So maybe that's more overlap than I thought. I've never used that before.
I've struggled with it in Undici, so yeah.
Okay.
So that doesn't have to be. And I'm not sure. I mean, we're not going for HTTP 1.0, right? Or are we? No.
I think we only support 1.1 in Node, unless I'm mistaken.
I
We
think
could
that's
also
a safe.
decide that.
Yeah,
we
just
don't.
broken from going forward. Seems
Yeah.
reasonable to me. I don't know. I haven't done anything that is requiring a 1.0 in a very long time.
But just to get an action item, it would be interesting to if somebody or several people investigated the actual, differences that we might need to have to address in the APIs, like push being one.
Yeah, that's the big one, I think, because that's the user-facing one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because if that's the only one, then I'm happy. Because the other thing to look here, I think James is going to be focusing on the more low-level stuff, the net core, net API. I think some of us could starting working the problem from the other side. How would the high-level API look like without worrying about the specific implementations of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's more where my interest lies.
Yes, I thought so.
So I'm just taking a quick glance because it's been a while since I've looked at even the docs page for HTTP2. And we do expose the HTTP2 session. And this is why I really want to see a real implementation. Are people using those things, or are they just skipping it, right? Because there's things you can do with them, but are people using that like in a real world scenario? Like, what does it look like? What features does it give you?
I have the impression that 99% of people are using the compat layer on the HTTP2.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't found much out there. Actually, including myself, I use the compat layer.
Yeah.
Because I still have to support HTTP1. So that's where you end up.
Yep.
I also assume most people would rather put their effort into building quick at this point rather than doing HTTP2 stuff when that is available. So
The other dimension I was wondering about is like, how does this fit with promise-based APIs? Which we're also talking about for core. Like, would this new one be promise-based, callback, provide both? That's probably another thing to kind of agree out on up front what the style is going to be.
I would prefer both.
yep. We'll have to, we can also let our resident promise experts put a little insight there, wherever they are.
I don't know. We have the same problem in Dici. I mean, there's promise-based and callbacks-based, but the generic one is streams.
Okay,
Right?
so or
one.
the not, yeah, so it's not one or the other even.
No. So the promise-based stuff is for me convenience, and I would like to move that to the web server frameworks. They should provide the convenience stuff over an implementation that provides the performance and the functionality.
Yeah, I think performance to me is the big reason why I say both, because in any performance critical code I'm writing, I'm always using callbacks. I don't want to deal with the complexity that promises introduce around performance. It's not that they don't just instantly make things slow, but like there's enough things where if you do something wrong here and you don't notice that, you change it together and then you end up with 30 promises being created on every HTTP request for one asynchronous operation. Like, it's happened to me. So I've just stopped and I just went back to that for any performance critical piece. But like you said, we need to expose a great promise API to the end user. I think that's a requirement, whether that's done through the server frameworks or core, I'm a bit more indifferent. I actually think that letting people opt into worse performing core behavior because it actually lets them use the core API directly is actually a good thing. If we have a util.promisify implementation that wraps this, that's fine to me. Like, you know,
the problem there is that we, at least from my experience with Node.js, you end up with adding extra APIs that make sense as a promisified version that you need to maintain, etc. And now I'm mostly talking about the pipeline, I mean streams versus promise part, which makes me, yeah, that's basically another thing. Sorry.
Yeah, streams and promises are pretty hard in my experience there.
Which is why I think it works perfectly as like, this could be a great like plugin or like a working group like thing on top of the core, where it's like, hey, do you want promises? Use this. It's a direct like extension from core, but it's separately maintained, so we don't get that clutter in core.
So we have a separately maintained thing built on a separately maintained thing built on top of core. I mean, I'm sort of joking there just to point out, like, I think we should keep things simple.
Yeah.
Start, and if that means just doing callbacks because we can reliably create the APIs and experiences and performance that we know we need, and then we look at it and say, where do promises fit? Do they fit well? And if, like, you know, you're seeing it in Indici, if they don't, and you make promise specific APIs, then we can consider, you know, leave that to the framework or add a new layer that wraps it, that exposes a promise API, or, you know, those kind of decisions can be made once we've laid the groundwork. I've got a truck coming, so I'm gonna
I totally agree.
Mm-hmm. Same.
I think we should start as simple as possible and then see what makes sense. Because when you start talking about promise APIs, for me, that includes async generators and stuff like that as well.
Yeah.
And then, you know, the fun begins.
So, I mean, I think it's like, so it's important to like document the plan so that when everybody comes and says, well, what about, well, wait a sec, there's no promises. You can say, look, here's our explanation of why we're doing this, or, you know, just, we need to have, I think, a clear explanation of, you know, what the strategy is and how they fit, because I'm sure that question will come, right, when people come to look at something new.
Mm-hmm.
From my side, I mean, the most important part is to provide the functionality and, you know, a high quality, reliable functionality without lots of edge cases, and the performance. And the rest can be built on top of that.
Yeah, the simplest thing you can do to meet the requirement, the less likely you're going to get into trouble later, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I like that.
I would say, you know, convenience and helper functions are nice, but that's not the priority per se.
And we don't want to, we should also like look directly at what made our current implementations such a strain to maintain and develop over time. And we should make sure that we don't repeat ourselves. You know, we got to see how Deno did a lot of things, which is good for us to evolve as well. When we're doing this sort of rewrite, we can be like, okay, like maybe let's take a step back at the beginning and make sure we're not falling back into patterns that burned us years down the road.
Yeah, on that note, one thing I think we can make some clear decisions on is moving toward only supporting web standards where that's possible. So instead of having like a bunch of URL stuff, like we will accept URL objects. You know, the headers API is another good example, like move to those. If we want to do clients, we need to look at fetch. Like, I think we can learn from them in that they came along after those existed and used them. I don't think we should, you know, re-implement the things on top of the existing Node APIs
No.
where we don't need them, you know.
No.
Cool. I'll say we have we only have a little bit of time left. So do we want, is there anything, I mean, like the more direct action piece, I guess, of today's call is going to be the the repo, and then we start laying out, I guess, these coding bits. Is there any other pieces that we want to make as action items for today's meeting?
Ping James and Mateo and hopefully get them to come to either the next meeting, or maybe we need to schedule a separate time, if whatever, you know, whatever gets the attendance that we need out of them as the, like, you know, primary driving forces in the core layers and the lower level stuff. We need to find a time that works to get us all.
I think getting them signed on, one of the two of them signed on as a champion for strategic initiative would be good.
We could just ask them what time works best for them at this point. Like, we've seen the interaction with the working group, and we've seen the direction the working group is going. And I think, you know, we can continue to have these working group meetings to discuss the things that land in this group. But for this particular item, we should probably try and find a time when they are available, and we can target that as the meeting for this specific piece, and still make it open. But, you know, that way we can guarantee that they'll be there.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
I think James' drawing is good here. We need them for the Node.js core jurisdiction. Oh, fuck, I can't pronounce English anymore. Parts.
Excellent. Well, I think we did end up using the whole time, so that's awesome. Because the other two things were really just things that had been sitting on there for a while, and I don't think there's much update, especially since improved set header is going to move into this new initiative. So
cool. So who is going to be doing these things? Is anyone going to be submitting the request for the repo? Knows how to do that?
I have done that. Oh, actually, well, I submitted something different. Anyway, if anybody else wants to do it, that's fine. But I can also do it if nobody's. It's not hard. I mean,
I'm happy to do it. I'll just. Is there a process that I need to be aware of?
Just search for, like, go into the admin repo, look at the closed issues, and like maybe search for repo in the title.
Okay. Repo.
I'm just thinking you'll be able to find an example.
Also, Wes, do you think you could start, you know, drawing up a high-level API? I'd love to help you out, but I think it's good if you start it out. How that could look.
Can start that. I'm in a bit of a life change scenario, which has drawn me a little bit thin. I'm moving for a bit. Let me. But I'm supposed to leave our house on Saturday. And so that's the end of the, like, big, my time is totally sucked up with, you know, non-open source things. So maybe next week, but I just don't want to, my point here, sorry, it's just that I'm not sure I'm ready to commit to being able to do that on a timely fashion. My hope is that within maybe 2 weeks, I'll be settled down and can really get back into this stuff.
Yeah, I don't think
it'll take a lot of time.
We're looking at the time span of weeks here, so I think
yeah,
that's good. But
okay, yeah, let me go in and I'll maybe make a gist and just get started with some of my thoughts that I've had before, and then when I have that, I can post it and for the group.
And the other of us can brainstorm around that, and then when you have time to get back again, you can, you know, continue there.
Yep.
I found it, how to create a repo. So I will do it's a 72 hour wait period, I think. So I will post for HTTP next and say 72 hours. If anyone has a different name idea or disagrees, then we'll converse. Otherwise, we'll go with HTTP next.
Yeah, and just put in a little description of like what the repo is going to be used for, and, you know, I guess you can point to it's going to be used by the web frameworks team that already exists, and just give people a little context. But yeah, nobody's going to complain, I don't think.
Perfect. All right, well, I'll do that. I'll cover that one. It sounds like you guys have some stuff for the technical side. I'll definitely love to see that whenever it is created. Other than that, I don't think there's anything else for us today, is there?
Nope. And we're
I'm
at
good.
time.
Awesome. Perfect.
Cheers, guys.
All right.
Talk to y'all later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you very
everybody.
much.
Bye.